Good evening, Professor Goodman. This is Michael Clark. I'm attempting to provide you with an on-time presentation of my Columbia case study memo. Here I'm going to try to provide you with a summary of the paper and highlighting some of the more significant lessons that suggest themselves to me to take away from the case, although there are many, many. Just wanted to point out I've been dealing with some tech issues all day. I'm kind of taking a crash course in this. With as far as the tech stuff goes, I guess this camera on my computer doesn't work. Never really done the slide stuff before, and I've certainly never used this software here before, so I can't edit it or anything. I'm just throwing this out here in one shot. But nevertheless, it's a little oversimplified as far as the slides go, and I'm sorry I couldn't get the camera working. But nevertheless, I think substantively, hopefully, I'll be on point here. Just a quick note: like I enjoyed the case study. I liked the medium that we studied it in. And it let me into, I read over kind of skimmed through the CAIB report some and watched a couple of like documentary videos on the case. Pretty interesting, like learned some interesting stuff. In any event, with that being said, we'll get underway here. So obviously the idea that I was trying to, with the case study, we're trying to understand the causes and contributing factors to the loss of STS-107 or the Columbia, as well as the astronauts on board. Obviously the organizational causes is what we're looking at here in the context of the course as well. And I guess I'll start here just kind of with a little synopsis of the flight. So the foam debris separates from the bipod, connecting the orbiter itself to the external tank. It's something that happened all the time. It strikes the left wing of the Columbia, puts about a 16-inch hole in it, I believe. The astronauts were never aware during flight at any time, I don't believe, that the foam came off and caused damage or to the threat of the damage posed. But in any event, ultimately, upon re-entry to the Earth's atmosphere, hot gases would go into the damage caused by the foam, causing structural damage and ultimate failure. The space shuttle blew up, disintegrated on re-entry. So that's the physical cause that's pretty much universally agreed upon. There's not really any argument there. But as the CAIB report points out, there's organizational causes at NASA itself that contributed just as much to the disaster, and those are obviously what we're interested in here. So most of the time, the discussion of these organizational factors starts out by placing it in a larger context, usually a historical context. Of NASA as an organization, as well as the space shuttle program more specifically. And the way that I think that the contrast here is best, or this discussion is best taken, is by drawing a contrast between some environmental factors that are that were present sort of in the early NASA, Mercury and Apollo missions versus when the space shuttle program was conceived. The early NASA was characterized by JFK's challenge to put a man on the moon, by the end of the decade, and it's just a huge amount of government and public support that kind of was drummed up on this sort of existential threat posed by the Soviets gaining an advantage in the space race. This essentially translates to the what I would say is that so NASA is basically operating as an organization with unlimited resources, not literally. But it's a huge priority. Their mission is a huge priority. Space exploration, the development of space technology is a huge priority at that point. The time of the space shuttle's inception, however, is much, much different. At the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, where you have a new administration in the White House with fiscally conservative principles that they're trying to instill throughout government, economic performance standards. Trying to streamline, kind of sort of like bureaucratic kind of control, things like that are what's shaping the environment that NASA faces when they have to negotiate for the space shuttle program to secure funding. So it's essentially much different than being in an environment where they kind of feel like they have unlimited resources. They now are just one among many other organizations competing for scarce resources and actually pretty low on the list of the chief executive. So this is, this is where I would start the sort of context to place this within. And then the second thing to point out is NASA's response to this environment. So, NASA obviously wants to secure the resources that it needs to carry out its primary mission, and they have to display some resiliency. They're not just going to just kind of roll over and let their mission die. So, but this response that they have is largely shaped by Nixon's sort of fiscal conservatism and these economic performance standards and justifications that he has, and as well as some influence by another important player is the DoD. But it's kind of as a result of Nixon's sort of the package that they have to put the space shuttle program in, which was originally meant as a part of the larger project, the space station project, which Nixon was not giving any chance to. So they basically settle on trying to develop this, what was originally meant to be like a ferry back and forth to the space station with supplies and for maintenance and things like that to take people back and forth. So basically what it is so Nixon's fiscal conservatism puts financial strain on NASA developing a space shuttle that can go into orbit and sort of be a launching mechanism for a reusable launching mechanism for their satellites and other sort of scientific research in space, etc. And so the fiscal strain that's put on them from this, they decided to try to supplement the funding by getting other clients to sign on and use this shuttle as their launching mechanism and maintenance and etc. sort of space needs. And so this brings on people like the DoD, but the problem is that bringing on these extra clients may supplement the funding, but what it also does is it adds further requirements to the space shuttle for broader capabilities. And also now you have to be able to launch when these people need you to launch, in addition to when NASA, the requirements that NASA has. You have additionally, you need to be able to fly more times per year. You got to have a quicker flight, turnaround time on the flights, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the second important issue of this. And this, at this point, I mean, you can point out one of the lessons that you're going to see that I think is relatively important here, and it's, organizations are ultimately going to have to adapt to change environments to secure the resources they need to carry out their mission. But it's important that when they do so, they don't set tasks that are so monumental that it's unlikely to be able to achieve them given the resources that they have. And so this is kind of what NASA did here. So through the negotiations with Nixon and the DoD, they kind of set themselves these tasks that were just nearly impossible to achieve given the technological developments that were necessary, et cetera, especially given NASA, what it was as an organization. It was not an organization set up on business principles. I mean, this is an organization that was founded, in an environment where their primary mission was very, very important. This is a much different environment that they're in now. So that's the first. So another issue of their response to this is, they now have a number of sort of monumental tasks that they have to sort of live up to, and one of the ways that they do this is by putting people in leadership positions that display values and characteristics that they think are necessary for achieving these sort of high goals that they've set for themselves. And so this essentially means that they're injecting sort of people with private principles and economic justifications for programs into management positions that are influential. Now this sort of affects, this is where I'm trying to say that it starts to affect the culture of what's going on there, because during the Apollo missions, NASA's schedule for launches, for example, would be set set by depending on the technology being developed for them to be able to launch the mission. But during the space shuttle program, a launching schedule is more determined by clients, deadline requirements for the things they need, such as the DoD and things like that, as well as the technological development itself is also being limited by the fiscal constraints and things like that. So they start putting these people in that can kind of help them do this, but they don't think about injecting this new, so it keeps the funding coming, but they don't think about the other organizational effects and how it's going to affect the primary mission. That's something that sort of slips here when they start to put these people in these management positions here. It doesn't make itself readily apparent. So the failure to make these internal structural changes, these private principles, what they essentially do is they compete. It really puts some competing interests into effect, internally in NASA, that weren't there before. I mean, I kind of picture, in the Apollo mission and the response to the disaster and stuff that happened, these are a bunch of engineers that are kind of leading this, and engineers and safety guys, and very smart guys, but not business people. And so now you bring a management team in that essentially creates two classes in there. You still have the engineers and the safety people who are the people that, developing the technology and making sure that everything is as safe as it can be, and things like that. But then you have the management, and they have other interests as well. I mean, of course, the primary interests are supposed to be a concern of management, but they also have to maintain the legitimacy of the goals that NASA has set before itself, not only to people outside the organization, but also inside, and kind of keep things moving along, to keep up appearances and things like that. And this is a whole new set of tensions that just wasn't there before, that just didn't exist, and they didn't really make any adjustments to it. And so it's kind of related to what I think is another important lesson that you can take away, which is that especially now when we think about the current climate, like it's almost inevitable that private principles are going to be injected into public service, just due to the nature of the available resources, the financial issues that places are facing now that they're not facing before. And also just a demand for some sort of performance standard and things like that. And it's, I mean, arguably the private principles themselves are not the problem. But what's the problem is that they have to be weighed in how they're going to relate to and affect the organization's overall primary goals. And that just was not really done at NASA. It became so embedded. The private motivations became so embedded that ultimately the inherent risk in the nature of the mission was overlooked, and had a catastrophic result. So that would be another lesson you could draw from. Another example, more specifically, is looking at the foam strikes and the way that they were classified. So this new culture that they have, the business principle, you can see it manifests itself in a number of ways, and one of them is this with the foam strike issues. The classification, the slip from anomaly to the in family out family classifications, and Dr. Woodnall discusses that it's a slip from a precise technical definition with a clear procedure to resolve to a more foggy distinction. And I think Dr. Halleck actually discusses it as something that's like it's based more on experience and familiarity. So it's like, this has happened before. It's happened a number of times. It's caused a whole bunch of damage, but it hasn't, basically killed anyone yet. So keep going, stay on schedule, stay on budget. And so this is the kind of this is one of the ways that this new culture kind of manifests itself. Without taking other the safety and the engineering, the technological development that was needed, took a back seat. Engineers, the Challenger is a perfect example. Engineers brought the concerns before management, but other things were made primary with disastrous results. Another way that it manifests itself is in Linda Ham, who just struck me from her just tone from the initial meeting that we heard in the case study. Just kind of struck me as she's very push it along. She kind of wants to hear the boxes are checked. She thinks that you get the impression that she feels like since she has fulfilled the formal obligations for her position, that things are going to be okay, and that's all that needed to be done. You kind of get the sense also that like once liftoff occurred, that was job completed for her, and you can see it in her not weighing the concerns of Lambert, who Lambert Austin, who both requested for the photos, although it was done informally, and ultimately he didn't get them, but also brought up the issue of the significant difference between the foam damage in this flight and the foam damage of the flight whose rationale she was allowing to justify her not going any further or not doing anything to try to save the astronauts. So this is my summary of the memo that I did. Like I said, I enjoyed the study, and look forward to hearing from you. All right, thank you.